Yeah, a different day here in London after the results, the biggest Conservative win since 1983. Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to a special edition from London, and it's going to be a very different UK Parliament to the one we had when Boris Johnson called that general election 5 weeks ago. He didn't have a working majority. Now he's got an advantage of 78 seats. It was daybreak when the Conservative leader addressed the faithful.
We will get Brexit done on time by the 31st of January. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. Leaving the European Union as one United Kingdom, taking back control of our laws, borders, money, our trade, immigration system, delivering on the democratic mandate of the people. And at the same time, this One Nation Conservative government will massively increase our investment in the NHS, the health service.
And we're joined by a former advisor to the Conservative Party, Stephen Canning. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Get any sleep?
I haven't been to sleep yet. I'm hoping at some point today I might.
All right, but you're elated. I can tell.
I think it's a historic moment, and I think that's keeping me awake. The opportunities that lie ahead for Boris Johnson and this government to deliver so much for people that haven't been able to for a long time. To get all this arguing of the last 3.5 years over, that's keeping me awake.
Now we heard in the remarks we just heard from the Prime Minister, we heard two facets of Boris Johnson. On the one hand, a call to unite the country, saying that the National Health Service was his top priority. Also, though, in the remarks, he says, we put an end to those miserable threats of a second referendum. That's not uniting talk, is it, when you talk of those who call for a second referendum as a miserable threat?
I think it is. At the end of the day, 3.5 years ago, a majority of this country voted for us to leave. I actually was on a different side of that debate, but I was one of those people that was willing to accept that and move on. And I think he has united the country by saying, come on guys, let's get together, let's move on, let's talk about other stuff, like the NHS, like other issues. And I do think he will unite the country. I think without the DUP pulling him to the right, he'll become more of a one nation Conservative, he'll embrace the NHS, and he'll do more for more people across the country.
Do more for more people across the country? Does that mean that the hard Brexit wing of the party will have less of a voice? We saw Jacob Rees-Mogg, for instance, who was front and center. We saw others who are very hard Brexiters. Is their voice going to be drowned out now that he's got this big majority? He doesn't need them as much.
I think everyone's voice is drowned out a little. The face of the Conservative Party has changed, perhaps forever. For something that's been criticised as being a London-focused, Southern-focused party, it now has a huge amount of its MPs up north, in places where there's never been Conservative MPs before, and it's been accused of ignoring those parts of countries for a long time. Well, it won't be able to anymore if it wants to keep winning those seats.
Won't be able to if it wants to keep winning those seats. What's the key? Are you saying that the Conservative Party is going to become a working-class party and the opposition is going to become more white-collar?
I think we've already seen that happen. I think we've seen a metropolitan elite across London once again be re-elected to lead the Labour Party. And in the north, we've seen in Bishop Auckland, we've seen in Durham, we've seen all those seats become working-class seats for the Conservative Party. So I think the Conservative Party is a completely different party today.
How much of that, though, is just weariness, sick of talking about Brexit? He had a slogan which said, let's get Brexit done. People want to be over with the conversation. Can he hold on to those new voters?
Well, I think that's the important part. It's now they need to work out how they deliver to those voters something beyond just Brexit, how they show people across the country that the Conservative Party is a party for the whole country. It is a one-nation conservatism. And then hopefully they'll keep winning those seats.
So what is that? What does that mean, one-nation conservatism?
I think that means investing in the north as much as you invest in the south. That means protecting and defending the NHS. That means ensuring we big up apprenticeships as much as we do university access. It's about delivering for everyone in the country, not just for a small part of it.
So hang on, this isn't a conservative agenda. You were talking about big infrastructure investment. These are left-wing issues.
Well, if you look at the manifesto that Boris Johnson put out, and you look at what a lot of people in the Conservative Party, big thinkers like people like Ben Bradley have been pushing the blue-collar conservatism movement, this is something that the Conservative Party has been trying to do for a long time, is show how it is a party for the whole country. And actually, historically, often, elections have been won when the working class and those who are aspiring class have got together to help run the country and take it better. And I think that's what we're seeing now.
Of course, he says get Brexit done. He really means get the divorce deal done, because getting Brexit done also entails trade negotiations. We just heard the French president here on France 24 speaking from Brussels, and of course Brexit was high on the minds. European leaders appreciating the fact that at least we know who we're dealing with. There's clarity in terms of who's in charge. That trade deal, though, can it be done within a year? What kind of a deal would you, Stephen Canning, like to see?
So I'm not going to pretend it's going to be easy, but I do think it can be done in a year. A lot of these trade deals everyone keeps referring to that take years and years are because we're trying to take two big economies and converge them together. We're starting at a place where we're both very converged, in fact completely converged, and all we have to try and do is find the places where we're willing to unconverge slightly. I think actually we're going to end up not pulling apart that much. I think we'll be outside of the European Union, but I think a lot of the regulations and stuff on goods will stay broadly similar, and over a period of years we'll slowly drift apart. But I do think a deal will be done.
All right, so you think at the beginning they'll be quite close. Of course, you know that we've been having all those discussions about this becoming Singapore upon Thames. You know that the way forward for Britain is a very low tax rate, and to forget the European Union. How many people within the Conservative Party are of that view, and how many of the people within the Conservative Party share your view?
Well, ultimately, I think that's a negotiating tactic as well. Much like in the lead up to getting this deal through the Parliament, the Prime Minister kept on saying we can't take no deal off the table. I don't think a lot of people in the Conservative Party wanted to no deal or ever wanted no deal, but a lot of people were saying we have to keep no deal on the table because you've got to have that threat there to push people in negotiation. I think the same is true with this Singapore on the sea. If we make it clear to the European Union that we are willing to become this low-tax entrepreneurial haven like Singapore, hopefully that does push them to negotiate with us properly and not try and walk over us.
Now, we talked a bit about the Conservatives before this election being beholden to their right wing. They're also beholden to the Northern Ireland Unionist Party, the DUP, which suffered in this election. It's a historic loss for the Unionists in Northern Ireland. Going forward, how's that going to change the Prime Minister's optics when he looks at whether or not you put that border in the Irish Sea?
Well, as I said earlier, I think he's most certainly not beholden to him anymore. The DUP no longer have a say over what goes on in here and over Brexit, any more so than any other small grouping.
So what future for Northern Ireland?
I think the big first thing on the Prime Minister's in-tray next week, hopefully he'll get the weekend off, will be the union. We've seen what's happened in Scotland with the SNP. I imagine Nicola Sturgeon has probably already written a letter to him saying she wants a referendum. I worry that people in Ireland will be agitating and pushing for similar sorts of things. So I think his first job next week will be how he keeps the union together.
And in the case of Scotland, how does he do it?
I think he makes it very clear that ultimately we've had a referendum. We said it was a once-in-a-generation referendum. If they want another one, that's for Parliament to decide, not for Scotland to decide. And it can be decided in the normal way Parliament decides things. Someone should bring a bill or a vote before the House to decide it.
Oh, okay. So Stephen Canning against a second referendum in Scotland?
Most definitely. It's a once-in-a-generation vote.
All right. Many thanks for that.
Thank you very much.
Stephen Canning, get some sleep.
Thank you.
All right. And it's a happy night, or if it's still night, even though it's now gone 1:30 p.m. here, close to 1:30 p.m. in the UK capital for those who've gone through the night. If you're on the winning side, again, a plus 78 margin for the Tories. There's a lot of soul-searching going on inside of the Labour Party. Its leader, Jeremy Corbyn, announcing he won't be leading the opposition into the next general election campaign, what with Boris Johnson set to be able to rule comfortably for 5 years if he wants to. A lot of long faces in the Labour camp.
It's a historic defeat for Labour. It's potentially their lowest result since 1935. It's an overwhelming confirmation of Boris Johnson's plan for the country, his plan for Brexit, and to be honest, it's very difficult to disagree with. The Conservatives have been very clear about what their plan is. Whether it's possible to execute is a separate question. They may run into a lot more problems over the next year or two, but for tonight, it does appear that people have decided what they want, in the short term at least.
It means the future of the country, they'll have a majority for 5 years, which is a bit depressing. People are fooled by the sunk cost fallacy of Brexit, whereby it's been going on for so long that they basically are tired of it and want to just believe the slogan that was pointed out to them. It's a very clever marketing campaign by Boris Johnson, and people just don't like, maybe, if it's to believe, people don't believe Jeremy, don't like him as a personality, which is a bit of a shame, really.
Okay, a lot of long faces inside the Labour Party, but there are winners as well. Let's say hello to Janet Dabby, re-elected as a Member of Parliament for Lewisham West. That's in the southeast of London.
So it's Lewisham East.
Lewisham
So
East,
yes,
excuse
yes.
me.
No, absolutely fine. So really pleased and happy to be re-elected as the Member of Parliament for Lewisham East. Yes, more of a majority as well, and Lewisham, the borough itself, was able to maintain its Labour seats. So yes, that in that sense positive, but a sense of a bittersweet nationwide for Labour as well.
So your local tale it reflects a little bit what happened nationally. That is to say, London, which used to be a safe Conservative stronghold, because there's so many people who are pro-Remain, has switched to Labour, and then those parts of the north that were industrial, which have gone the other way.
Yes, you're absolutely right. London is very strong Remain. In terms of the arguments, that the country would be better off if we remain in the EU, part of the EU. I've always campaigned to remain. My constituency itself is 65% Remain, but obviously that hasn't reflected itself in the whole country, and there's reasons why people have voted the way they have across the country.
So you have this first past the post system. So you have a national election with the standard bearers, and then you've got the local election. How much was your campaign in tune with that of Jeremy Corbyn's?
So in terms of Labour policies, some of the policies that we were putting forward I thought were absolutely excellent. To cancel tuition fees for people going to university, brilliant. To reduce the classroom size, to keep it under 30, fantastic. To increase the minimum wage to £10, to reduce train fares for young people. There are some excellent wins in there. To invest in our NHS, to invest in our nurses, our medicines. There was some excellent policies that would really improve people's standard of living, give them a sense of dignity, to deal with in-debt poverty, to deal with child poverty, and also housing. When I have my surgeries, the majority of the people that come to see me, issues are to do with like high rent, really, and overcrowding conditions.
So when you hear the Prime Minister saying the NHS is his top priority as Prime Minister, it's what he said after in his winning speech early in the morning, and also, talking about one nation. You just heard Stephen Canning before you for the Conservatives saying there's going to be lots of spending on infrastructure. What's your reaction?
What's my reaction? Well, I'm smiling in terms of, is this a joke from Boris? Because all we have to think about really is his level of deception and lies, and what he says about communities, and how that it increases hatred and intolerance in our society. But also, if we think about Jack, the 4-year-old boy that was in Leeds Hospital, and he was lying, he had pneumonia, and he was lying coats. And when the Johnson was being questioned by a journalist, he took the journalist's phone and put it in his pocket. So is that shame, embarrassment? Is that I don't care? Is that I don't know what to do? But that isn't a sign of compassion, of sensitivity. Oh my goodness, how do I help? How am I going to change this situation? What improvements am I going to make?
Because in his acceptance speech, Johnson talked about the fact that, look, I'm going to govern the way I was when I was mayor of London, hinting that he's more like Michael Heseltine than he is Margaret Thatcher. You're raising your eyebrow there.
Again, I'm raising my eyebrows again. When he was Mayor of London, I was the cabinet member for community safety in Lewisham. And at that time, he closed down fire stations. He fire service people lost their jobs. And you may know very much about the Grenfell Tower. And there is like the aerial ladder that goes up to the tower. He reduced those appliances, which meant then that it took longer to get the appliances to get to Grenfell to deal with that issue. He also introduced these water cannon fire things that, well, not fire, but water cannons that have never been used.
Right.
A huge expenditure that it wasn't cost. And then obviously he gave some funding to somebody who had a personal relationship with, but failed to declare that. So this is somebody who doesn't have a reputation that's clean and doesn't have a reputation of really delivering. This is somebody who uses charms and jokes and his jovial manner to seem to impress people in some way, and that deeply concerns me. It deeply concerns me for my constituents. It deeply concerns me for our nation. I want to eradicate child poverty. I want to eradicate food banks. I want to improve people's living conditions, and I want a great NHS.
All right, so let's talk about the Labour Party now. Just a few minutes ago, the leader, Jeremy Corbyn, speaking. Jeremy Corbyn, who says he won't be leading the party into the next election, did not signify, though, when he'd be standing down.
I called for last night a period of reflection in the party, and obviously the ruling body of the party, our national executive, will decide what process we follow then for the election of a successor to me. But I am quite prepared, and I was elected to do so, to lead the party until that takes place.
Janet Dabby, should Jeremy Corbyn have resigned this morning the way the leader of the Liberal Democrats did when she lost her seat?
The answer to that is we've not done very well across our country, and we need to put in place a new leader. Jeremy recognises that, and I think as a party we need to move forward with that plan.
Some of the some of those from the moderate wing of the party conspicuously low profile during this campaign. I saw you tweeted the fact that you had the likes of Keir Starmer coming to campaign for you in your constituency. Are you expecting that wing of the party to step up to the plate now, or is it definitely for good a left-wing party?
So Keir Starmer has been great around the Remain campaign. He's been an excellent shadow secretary, cabinet person, and I think that we need to be, as a party, we need to be more left of the centre very much. And I think Jeremy should be stepping down to allow somebody to move forward, to come forward and to make themselves known.
Should the next leader be more to the left or be more of a moderate?
I think he'd be more of a moderate, like myself.
Like yourself. And at this point in time, how do you win back those voters in the north?
The North is,
many of whom voted for Brexit.
And many people that have never voted Tory in their lives. So this would be a heart-rendering situation for them, and something that they will have to think long and hard about, and also have the effects of what Boris is going to do to the country in the meantime. We need to be having conversations. We need a leader who can regroup the party, but regroup the voters as well, and to give that message that we are a party, that we care for the vulnerable, we care for the deprived, we care for people that are experiencing inequality, we care for people, and we want to make our country great for everybody.
And on the issue of immigration, the fact that globalization is scary, and the fact that you've had a deindustrialization, can Labour answer those questions?
We have a situation where Johnson is in influenced by Trump and is in deals with Nigel Farage. And we have a Prime Minister who has suppressed the Russian report into the meddling of the elections. We need to focus on the Prime Minister actually taking our party further to the right and the disastrous effects that's going to have on our country. Labour, we are here for all people, for industries, for businesses, for poorer people, for all communities from all backgrounds, but mainly for those people as well who need us to fight for them, to be a voice for them, so they have an equal standing in life as much as everybody else.
Janet Dabby, 5 years you'll be spending another 5 years at least in that house behind us. Thank you so much for coming. I know you have to go pick up your children from school now.
I do, yes. I've only had 2 hours sleep. I have two lively, wonderful children that I'm looking forward to seeing, and hopefully we'll do something lovely. Well, I know we will do something lovely this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to putting them to bed and going to bed myself.
All right. Plenty of rest. You've earned it. Many thanks, and congratulations again on your win.
Thank you very much.
All right, you heard Janet Dabby talking there about how to win back those voters from the north. Boris Johnson, in his victory speech early in the morning, addressed those voters directly.
In winning this election, we have won votes and the trust of people who have never voted Conservative before, and people who have always voted for other parties. Those people want change. We cannot, must not let them down. Let's unite this country. Let's spread opportunity to every corner of the UK with superb education, superb infrastructure and technology. Let's get Brexit done.
Let's get Brexit done, and we're joined by Joe Twyman, co-founder of Delta Poll UK. Thanks for joining us on this brisk day after the election.
Yes, brisk it certainly is, but we appear to be entering a period of stability for this country for the first time in 5 years, and so we might not be down here as often as we have been previously.
Before I ask you to react to what we just heard from Boris Johnson, let's go over how you, the pollsters, did. On the one hand, not bad if you look at the overall picture. In terms of the popular vote, it's roughly on par, all the polling agencies with what they had been predicting. It's the number of seats that were tricky to determine.
Well, in a system such as we have in this country, it's extremely difficult to calculate how the national vote will translate into individual seats. And with 650 different battles, all of which have interesting hyper-local factors influencing the result, it is a difficult task. And we were broadly correct with the story of a Conservative majority, but the degree to which that majority took hold was particularly interesting. A lot of that is a function to do with the way that the campaigns work and the resources that are allocated to seats. And once you get past a certain threshold in terms of a majority, many seats then fall like dominoes, and so that's why it's particularly difficult to predict at either extremes of the result.
All right, let's just make this clear once again for our viewers. The Conservatives winning 1% more of the popular vote, 45%, than they did in the 2017 general election, yet switching from having a minority government to a 78-seat advantage, the biggest landslide for the Tories since 1983. 1% more of the popular vote equals plus 78. Explain that to us.
Well, because it's not just the Conservatives that are competing. The fall in the Labour Party is crucially important here. Last time they were nearly just 2 points behind the Conservatives in 2017. This time they're a long way behind. I think it's 34% of the vote they seem to be on, perhaps even lower than that. And it's that gap between the two parties that has meant that the Conservatives are able to pick up. So it's not just that the Conservatives are doing a little better, it's that Labour are doing a lot worse. That's what's propelled them. But also it's worth remembering that in a first-past-the-post system such as we have in this country, really small differences can have a huge impact. In 2017, the difference between the Conservatives getting a majority and the Conservatives getting the hung parliament that we ended up with was 75 votes. If 75 people in the right constituencies had switched their votes to the Conservatives, that would have made a majority. So it's really small margins.
And we see, for instance, the Liberal Democrats making gains but losing a seat. We see the Green Party gaining ground, and yet all that seems to have hindered Labour. This talk, and we talked a lot about it, you're probably bored of talking about it, this issue of tactical voting. what was tactical voting in the 2019 election? Did it work at all?
It doesn't seem to have had a major impact. What we saw in a lot of the northern constituencies that have switched to the Conservatives for the first time, in many cases, in fact, since the Second World War, what we saw there was, in a number of cases, the Conservative level of the vote staying pretty much where it was from 2017, but the Labour Party dropping right back. And so letting the Conservatives in simply by essentially getting the same people that they managed to turn out last time to turn out. That's what's causing the difference.
That's what's causing the difference, and the country's basically at a standstill still. I mean, when it comes to the issue of Brexit, there is no closure when you look at the numbers.
The country is still divided. The public still doesn't know the best way to move forward. But the crucial difference now is that Boris Johnson not only has this large majority, he also has the momentum behind him to actually get things through the Commons. And having that majority and being able to actually pass laws and get things through is a situation that we haven't really had in this country since the referendum itself.
Since the referendum itself, and on the other side of the aisle, you have people saying that in a lot of Labour constituencies, the number one issue that was coming up was not Brexit, but Jeremy Corbyn. Is that what your research found?
Yes, consistently we showed that the real difficulty the Labour Party faced was over the support that Jeremy Corbyn personally had. Because yes, they had popular policies, as indeed the Conservatives did as well, but most people aren't interested in the detail of these things. Instead, they look to the parties and they specifically look to the leaders to answer the question, who can I trust? Who do I think can be effective? Who will be right for the country? Who will be right for people like me? And often they would say that, yes, they didn't really like both people, but they disliked Jeremy Corbyn a lot more than they disliked Boris Johnson.
Joe Twyman, let me ask you a personal question. We've seen all the vitriol since the referendum back in 2016. We saw in this election a lot of people express shock at the result, especially here in the London area where there are a lot of Remainers. A lot of people express shock at the result because they're all inside of the, turn that phone off. That's all right.
So sorry.
Yes, it is live television. That's okay. We saw the Remainers who watching the campaign inside of their own echo chambers, if you will, and shocked to see the result, even though, as you've just described it, the result is pretty clear cut. Can we go back to a Britain that's an island of temperance and moderation?
Well, that's the theory, but there's no evidence that should necessarily happen. It will be interesting to see where this country now goes. As I say, we are still divided on this hugely important issue of Brexit. We don't know whether the kind of changes that we're going to see will placate people in either direction, or whether we'll be stuck with this moving forward. But I think that one of the crucial differences that we're seeing now compared to even sort of 10 years ago is the role of social media and the ability for people to surround themselves in bubbles simply with people who agree with them and share their views. And if you do that, it can sometimes be difficult to appreciate what the wider country, what the wider electorate may think, and to consider whether you are necessarily in a majority or a minority.
So moderate conservatives saying, effectively, they're not saying it out loud, but they're sort of hinting that it'll be easier to drown out the more radical voices within their party because you have such a big majority. With social media, though, will we still hear those voices louder and louder?
Yes, and that's right. And people often confuse noise with volume. In other words, just because a small group of people can make a lot of noise, it doesn't mean that they are a large group of people.
But do they influence the vote?
Well, I think the influence of social media is greatly exaggerated. I think what they do is convince people that everything else they hear is wrong, even though the other information available to people can actually sometimes be helpful.
How much sleep?
Not a lot.
Not a lot.
Not a lot.
And are you still poring over the numbers? What's the biggest surprise?
The biggest surprise was probably actually some of the individual constituencies, some that held on and some that were defeated. So
what do you make of Wales, where?
Well, it's not just Wales, actually. I mean, you could point to so many constituencies, some of which have not been anything other than Labour since the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. The fact that so many of those switched, many of which were in Wales, many of which were in the north of England, that's a really interesting development.
All right, Joe Twyman, I hope you get some rest this weekend. Many thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
All right, and it's been a bit of a tsunami politically in Wales, also in Northern Ireland, where we saw the unionists find themselves for the first time in the minority when all the votes are counted there for the number of MPs that they'll be sending back to the building behind us here. And then there's Scotland, where the SNP is back to its levels of 2015, what with a gain of 13 seats. The First Minister already thinking second independence referendum.
People in Scotland will have made very clear that they didn't want Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, that they don't want Brexit, and they want Scotland's future to be in Scotland's hands. And there is a mandate now to offer the people of Scotland a choice over our own future. That mandate already existed and it has been reinforced.
Now of Simon Fitzpatrick with political risk consultants Cicero, and you hail from?
I hail from Scotland originally.
Whereabouts?
Just outside Glasgow. Western Bartonshire was my constituency when I lived up there.
How did it go there?
SNP hold. It was an increased majority for the SNP in that constituency. Like a lot of constituencies in the west of Scotland, that was a Labour-held seat for many decades, which the SNP won in 2015 and have held again last night. But I mean, I think that's the picture really across the country last night was of real SNP progress. I think Nicola Sturgeon can be very pleased with her night's work. As you said, I think 13 gains overall from the 2017 performance, which had been a bit of a setback for the SNP, but last night was a real step back in the right direction from Nicola Sturgeon's perspective towards that second independence referendum.
We were talking a minute ago with pollster Joel Twyman about the system you have in the UK with first past the post. You have a majority, if you look at the numbers for Scotland, of people who are not pro-independence in the vote, and yet the SNP wins by a landslide.
That's right. It's the distribution of the votes is all important. We saw last night votes for the SNP plus the very small number of votes for the Scottish Green Party, the pro-independence parties totaled about 46%, and the pro-UK parties totaled about 54%. That's a pretty similar sort of distribution to the yes and no vote in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. So, you know, depending on how you look at it, a lot has changed in the intervening 5 years, but yet actually, if you look at it just along that sort of slightly crude metric, actually the balance of support between pro-independence and pro-UK has not actually hugely shifted.
All right, Scotland, which voted squarely for remaining inside of the European Union. Now we're going to get into the thick of it, right? Because the divorce deal goes through on before January the 31st. That's what the Prime Minister has promised. Yep. And then there's the negotiation for this trade deal. Britain's leaving the European Union. Does Scotland have a better case than it did in the last independence referendum for leaving the UK?
Well, Nicola Sturgeon would certainly say so, yes. You know, the position of the SNP ever since the 2014 referendum on Scottish independence has been that if a material change in circumstances came along, that Scotland would have a legitimate case for going to the polls again on the independence question. Brexit, when it happens, assuming it certainly is going to happen now on the 31st of January, is undeniably a material change in circumstance. But there was another condition which the SNP did set in one of the previous manifestos, which was that there should be sustained evidence that the views of the people of Scotland on the independence question have changed. And so far the polling doesn't actually suggest that on the independence question views have materially
Why is that?
changed. I don't know. I mean, arguably it's because we've not left yet and we're not yet fully feeling the effects of Brexit. There's also an argument which says people are looking at the difficulty of the process of Brexit and saying, well, that's the UK trying to extricate itself from a 40-year-old union. What's it going to be like if Scotland tries to extricate itself from a 300-year-old union? So that's one argument. But I also think that the 2014 referendum, whatever one thinks about it, it was a referendum that lasted for really 3 years. We had an extremely in-depth debate about it. People established quite well-entrenched positions on that independence question. And of course there's been some churn, some people going back and forth, but it's not something that people are going to lightly change their minds about, in my opinion.
Not lightly change their minds about. Let's talk about what happens next, because you guys are political risk consultants. And part of that is, of course, weighing what's going to happen economically. We saw the pound surge. We saw shares in businesses that work domestically go up this Friday. We've heard the congratulations from Europe that there is at least clarity. We know where we're going. There's no more of this uncertainty inside of the House of Commons. Yet, do we know economically really what Brexit means at this point?
I'm not sure if we do. I think that, what's going to happen on 31st of January is we're going to go into a transition period, obviously. So even at that point, we're still probably not going to be feeling the full effects that it may or may not have. The big question then is going to be whether or not the transition period is extended beyond the end of December next year. Boris Johnson's line on that is that it is not going to be, that we'll be sort of fully out and into our new relationship by the end of December. I suspect that might be another political debate that we're having by, the summer of next year, but as it stands, we're still going to be in transition for next year, and so that probably defers the real effect of.
So it's too early.
I think it probably is, yeah, and a lot of it's going to ultimately depend on what the future trading relationship that we do or don't end up with looks like.
Simon Fitzpatrick, when you look at that building behind us there, we forget, because it now seems like it was ancient history, but the last Labour Prime Minister in this country was a Scot.
He was indeed, yeah. I mean, it seems a long time ago.
Gordon Brown, and it seems like ages ago. Can Labour ever rebound without having a stronghold in Scotland?
It makes it very difficult. I mean, for Labour, without the sort of 40 or 50 Scottish seats that they were traditionally able to rely on, they're almost starting any general election campaign with one hand tied behind their back. So getting seats back in Scotland would be a huge boost to their chances UK-wide. But that's a huge task for Labour. A lot of those traditional working class Labour voters in Scotland, the parts of Scotland that I come from, they've sort of gone over to the SNP side. They're quite pro-independence now, by and large, a lot of them. And Labour is quite uncomfortable, I would say, having debates around constitutional politics. Labour wants to have debates about, investment in public services and the health service and so on.
And the Labour Party supporters in your constituency, you're in Glasgow, what do they make of all the infighting that's been going on? The fact that Jeremy Corbyn was equivocal when it came to Brexit, that he was equivocal when it came to what his top issue was?
I think for people that are still, current Labour Party supporters in Scotland and activists and politicians in Scotland, I think Jeremy Corbyn's somewhat equivocal position was very unhelpful. As far as being,
are they left wing or are they more pragmatic, want of a sort of a centrist position?
I think there's a bit of a mix. I think the leader in Scotland, Richard Leonard, the Scottish Labour leader in Scotland, is of the Jeremy Corbyn wing, and I think there's an increasing influence of that wing of the party in Scotland as there is elsewhere in the UK. But I think for them, if one of the groups of voters that they need to try and win back is that sort of very strongly pro-UK group of voters, a lot of them saw the Conservatives as a stronger pro-UK voice. Particularly when Ruth Davidson was the leader, they made some big strides forward in 2017. And for Labour trying to re-establish themselves as one of the strongest sort of pro-UK forces in Scottish politics, having a leader that is equivocal about whether or not he would be willing to grant a second Scottish independence referendum is not particularly helpful.
Not particularly helpful. Simon Fitzpatrick, one final question, not about Scotland, but about the UK as a whole. Which Boris Johnson will it be as Prime Minister? The one who, even in his victory speech, taunted Jeremy Corbyn this morning, or the one who talks about Big Tent policies, the NHS?
I think your guess is probably as good as mine on that. I mean, Boris Johnson, whatever one thinks of him, he's a very adept political shapeshifter, as it were. He knows how to tailor his message and the sort of campaigns that he runs to suit the political moment that he's in. When he was twice elected mayor of this city that we're in, he ran very much as that kind of socially liberal, pro-business mayor. When he ran the Brexit campaign, he appealed to more of that sort of populist message. And as Prime Minister, you know, now that he's got his majority, I think we'll see what sort of Prime Minister he really wants to be. The early indications are that he was sort of trying to give some of that one nation type rhetoric this morning, but whether or not that persists throughout the next 5 years, time will tell.
Time will tell indeed. Simon Fitzpatrick of political risk consultant Cicero, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and there is at least clarity. That's the message from European leaders meeting at a summit that has just broken up in Brussels. Claire Rush has more.
Ready for the next phase of Brexit. For many EU leaders, Boris Johnson's resounding victory is a sign that an orderly withdrawal is on the near horizon, bringing clarity to an issue that's hounded the bloc since 2016. Brussels is now looking ahead to the next step, the ratification of Johnson's divorce deal by UK lawmakers. The British Parliament is now poised for a second reading of Johnson's withdrawal agreement, a move the EU hopes will come quickly, as expressed by French President Emmanuel Macron.
Once there's clarity on legal and institutional levels, we'll drive forward together over the next few months and build a common future.
Future trade talks are also on the minds of EU leaders.
I'm confident that we can increase the economic and commercial links between our two countries. His victory, which was so clear-cut, allows us to think about an orderly Brexit.
Once the withdrawal bill is passed by both the British and European parliaments, attention will turn to negotiating a free trade accord, meaning difficult and potentially divisive talks may still be yet to come.
And we can go now to Brussels and our Europe editor, Catherine Nicholson. Catherine, the French president, among those saying at least there's clarity.
Yes, that's President Macron's word. We're hearing that from a lot of people as well. Clarity about the path ahead for Brexit. Boris Johnson has the working majority he needs to pass the withdrawal agreement through the British Parliament and effectively end the UK's membership of the European Union by January the 31st or perhaps even sooner. So this clarity is something that European leaders have been seeking ever since the UK decided in that referendum in 2016 that it did want to leave the EU. The EU leaders saying across the board, look, they don't want Brexit to happen, but if it's going to happen, then let's get on with it and let's all forge a path ahead and work out the future relationship. So yes, the election really sounding the death knell for any of those leaders here in the EU who might have been hoping for some kind of second referendum or some way of getting the UK to remain in the EU, and also really setting their sights on the second phase of the negotiations.
Yeah, that second phase is going to be crucial. With the second negotiation about to get underway, January 31st is by which time Boris Johnson promises there will be the divorce period, but the trade deal to follow. Any word from this summit as to what it may look like, the negotiations for that?
Yeah, there certainly is quite a lot of talk about that next phase of negotiations here at the summit. We've had, Emmanuel Macron, who we referenced earlier, he's been talking about how he wants a close partnership between the UK and the EU. That's something we've heard as well from Angela Merkel, from the former Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel, who's now the president of the European Council. So clearly that's an intention for this negotiating mandate that looks like it's definitely going to be given to Michel Barnier within the next few weeks. But there's also warning warnings in there. You know, the EU saying, okay, you know, you're our close neighbour, we want friendly, close relations with you in the future. But there's a lot of talk as well, warning the UK off unfair competition on the EU's doorstep, what they call it a level playing field. There are fears, for example, that the UK might slash its corporation tax even further to encourage more economic activity in the UK post-Brexit. If so, well, how far can the UK go before the EU considers that that's creating unfair conditions for the UK? We keep hearing people here, at least, talking about what they call Singapore on Thames, the UK turning into some kind of low corporation tax, sort of tax haven sort of place where there could be unfair competition with the EU's remaining 27 member states. Other key thematic issues, I think we can say, for the future relationship. Angela Merkel picked out a couple. She said that access to the UK's fishing waters is likely to be a big area of discussion. Of course, the UK and Ireland surrounded by waters in which currently EU member states can have access to the UK's fish. It was one of the big issues of the Brexit campaign itself. That is likely to be contentious. French fleets, Belgian fleets and others really quite dependent on that access to UK waters, and they will be fighting tooth and nail to keep it. Angela Merkel also flagging up security cooperation with the EU, and that's something that I actually put just now in an interview to the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell. I asked him how concerned he was about keeping close security cooperation with the United Kingdom in this time of heightened security concern. He said that he feels quite confident that it will be in both parties' interest to keep that cooperation going. But of course, it's easier said than done. There's plenty of details to be hammered out in terms of sharing of resources, of information. So many details to be hammered out in such a short time span to do it in.
And of course, there was this congratulatory tweet from the President of the United States. Catherine, if I can, it's pretty windy here. If I can read it to you, congratulations to Boris Johnson. Massive trade deal to come, he says. This deal has the potential to be far bigger and more lucrative than any deal that could be made with the EU. Celebrate Boris! Exclamation point. What are the optics on that where you are?
Well, you know what's interesting? I actually haven't really heard anybody talking about Donald Trump in terms of European Union leaders in any case. Here at the summit, there's all the focus is being kept on how the EU is going to forge its own relationship with this member that is now leaving the EU. Obviously, as I said, there's concerns about what the UK might do to its own economic and trading conditions after it's left the EU are a concern, but specific references to the UK's relationship with the United States haven't been made as of yet. You've got to remember that the EU is continuing that line that we've heard all the way through this Brexit process, that it doesn't want to interfere in the UK's own internal political discussions and the UK's own internal matters. The EU very much focusing for diplomatic reasons, I think we can say, on its own relationship and areas where it can have some agency with the UK.
And we can listen on that score to the French President Emmanuel Macron addressing reporters in the past hour.
Plus l'accord commercial est ambitieux,
The more ambitious the UK's trade agreement with the EU, the more it will have to fall in line with EU regulation. It's a simple choice for the British. They already adhere to these regulations as a member of the EU today. Whenever they move away from a piece of regulation, they risk creating more distance in their trade agreements with the EU. That's more or less how it will work.
Je schématise, mais c'est à peu près ça.
It could be quick and easy if they say, actually, we don't want to change much. Or it could take longer.
Prendre plus de temps.
Up to this general election, Emmanuel Macron, who'd been playing bad cop, telling the British to decide what they wanted effectively. Catherine Nicholson, looking back, how much of that was political grandstanding? Did he really mean it?
I think Emmanuel Macron really did mean it. You'll remember, Francois, that when Emmanuel Macron was elected president of France back in 2017, he walked on stage on election night to the European anthem, Ode to Joy, with a big European flag behind him as well. And he quite quickly tried to establish himself very much as a leader in Europe, making his big speech at the Sorbonne about how he wanted the EU to start a new phase, turn a new page. Emmanuel Macron has a lot of ambitions for projects in Europe. Now, since 2017, a lot of them have been weakened. Some have almost entirely fallen by the wayside. Things like a Eurozone budget, that kind of thing, much more military cooperation in the European Union. But Emmanuel Macron is a man who believes in Europe. He really is a pro-European. He wants to keep the integrity of the European Union together. Again, he's somebody who's said many times that he regrets Brexit, but if it's happening, then let's do it and let's have the best situation possible afterwards. So yeah, that hardline stance from Emmanuel Macron in terms of giving extensions to the Brexit negotiations, the French government feels very much vindicated by taking that stance because, as we've heard, they do feel that they have now got a clear position and path ahead from the United Kingdom. I think it'd be interesting to see, though, if the issue of an extension to the transition period comes up, what kind of position France and the other member states might take on that. As I mentioned just before, there are so many details to be sorted out. We're not just talking about the trading relationship, there's the security relationship, all kinds of aspects about citizens' rights, all that kind of thing. And the deadline for the end of the transition period is December 2020. If the UK does want to have an extension to that transition period, as many people are suggesting today, they're going to have to ask for it by July the 1st. So I think we're going to be coming back to this question of how hardline the French are if and when that request for an extension to the transition period comes up.
All right, it's gone a little past 3 o'clock in Brussels at the conclusion of a European summit. Many thanks, Europe editor Catherine Nicholson. It's gone 2 p.m. in the UK capital, where it's been a sleepless night. For some, a night of celebration. For others, a night of soul-searching. A very different UK Parliament will be installed. We saw earlier Boris Johnson go to visit the Queen to ask the permission to form a new government with a 78-seat majority, the biggest Tory win since Margaret Thatcher defeated Labour in 1983. And now comes the arduous task of deciding where he's going to govern. Boris Johnson, will he tack more to the centre? Will he try, after picking off all those traditionally strong Labour seats, will he try to cater more to that audience? James Vazina has a look back at the day that's been.
It's a blue tidal wave that swept across the United Kingdom. The Conservatives have secured their greatest win since Margaret Thatcher's victory in 1987. A majority that will give Boris Johnson the powers he needs to take Britain out of the European Union.
We pulled it off, didn't we? We will get Brexit done on time by the 31st of January. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. Leaving the European Union as one United Kingdom.
It's COVID. But it was a catastrophic night for Labour, as the party's facing its biggest defeat in over 80 years. The Red Wall began crumbling in the early hours as Labour strongholds in the north of England and in the Midlands, who'd voted in favour of Brexit, turned blue.
Brexit has so polarised and divided debate in this country. It has overridden so much of a normal political debate. I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign.
But Labour wasn't the only party to suffer a crushing defeat. Jo Swinson lost her seat in East Dunbartonshire to the SNP.
For millions of people
a nightmare for the party who'd promised to cancel Brexit. The Liberal Democrats are now set to elect a new leader, while an ecstatic Nicola Sturgeon claimed a landslide victory for the SNP in Scotland. But it was a different story for the DUP, as its deputy leader Nigel Dodds lost his seat in North Belfast to Sinn Féin. as for the first time, Irish nationalists will be sending more MPs than the Unionists to the British Parliament.
And that was a report there by James Vizina. And just a programming note for you here on France 24 as our coverage continues of the 2019 general election. We'll have a special edition of The World This Week right here from the banks of the Thames. That's at 6:10 p.m. UK time, 7:10 p.m. Paris time. Do join us later. More coverage also on our website, france24.com.
En France 24 nos esforzamos